The world, for a billionaire, is a neatly ordered thing. Michael's was a series of closed-door deals, perfectly timed flights, and spreadsheets that predicted the future with terrifying accuracy. But the one he was in now was a mess. A total, sickening, chaotic mess. It began with the sound of his children screaming, not a cry of fear from a nightmare, but a sharp, panicked wail. His private jet had landed 3 hours earlier at LAX. A business crisis had demanded his immediate return from Shanghai, and he had come home without notice. The house was quiet, and the front door was unlocked. Michael, used to the silent efficiency of his life, felt a prickle of unease. He followed the sound of the cries to the kitchen, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was prepared for anything, a broken toy, a small fall. But nothing, not the thousands of deals he'd signed or the countless crises he'd averted, could have prepared him for what he saw. The kitchen was a mess of baby toys and half-eaten snacks, but it was the large kitchen sink that held his attention. His twins, 6-month-old Caleb and Chloe, were in a plastic tub inside the sink. They were red and wet with tears, their tiny hands desperately clinging to the edges of the tub. Hovering over them, a woman he had trusted with his life, Olivia, the maid. Her face was a mask of cold professionalism as she poured steaming water from a silver kettle. A cold wave of horror washed over him. This wasn't a scene of a maid making a mistake, it was the work of a monster. Then, his eyes fell on a glowing screen in her free hand. It was a smartphone. She was live-streaming the scene, a small green light blinking on the top of the phone. The horrifying scene he was witnessing was a public spectacle, a macabre performance he had unknowingly funded. He wanted to rage, to scream, to grab his children and run. But something held him back. He saw a tiny chat window on the phone screen, and he read a comment. "More hot water, please. They're not crying loud enough." The comment was from a username he recognized. It was his own chief operating officer, a man he had trusted for years. If you want to know what this monster is really up to, you have to subscribe. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a random act of evil. It was a planned, sophisticated conspiracy. Olivia wasn't a maid, she was a live streamer, but she wasn't alone. The man who was supposed to be his right hand was a co-conspirator. He froze, his mind reeling. He had come home to expose a traitor, but instead, he had uncovered a quiet, chilling evil and was confronted with the terrifying reality that his children's suffering was a public show, a macabre performance he had unknowingly funded. His family's pain was entertainment for an audience, a morbid spectacle for a network of powerful people. He had to stop this. He had to save his children. But how? His whole life, he had relied on his power, his money, his connections. Now, all those things seemed to be part of the very plot against him. If you want to see how a man who has everything will fight back with nothing, then you better subscribe and watch the rest of this. He retreated from the doorway, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He ran out to his car, fumbling for his phone. He needed a plan, a fortress of his own. He couldn't go to the police, they could be compromised. He couldn't trust his lawyers or his security team, not when his own COO was involved. He needed a team of his own, a secret one. He made a series of frantic, desperate calls, not to his usual contacts, but to the shadows. The first call was to a former employee, a brilliant but disgraced programmer named Leo, who had a reputation for getting things done outside the law. "Leo, it's Michael. I need your help. It's about a situation with my twins. It's complicated." He didn't explain more. He couldn't. The call ended with Leo agreeing to a secret meeting. The second call was to a retired private investigator, a former CIA operative named Elena, known for her ability to navigate the darkest corners of the world without being seen. Elena, I need you. I have a problem, and it involves a lot of money and a lot of power. And my children. She listened in silence and simply said, "Tell me where to meet you." His final call was to a junior analyst he had overlooked for years named Liam. He was an orphan, a foster kid who had been in the system for years and had a unique understanding of how these kinds of networks operate. Michael had never seen him as more than a number, a face in the crowd. Now, he was his last hope. Don't be left in the dark. Subscribe and find out what happens next. As Michael ends the call with Liam, his phone rings again. It's a number he doesn't recognize. He hesitates, but answers. A robotic, disguised voice speaks. "We know what you saw. We'll be in touch." The line goes dead, leaving Michael alone in his car, with a newfound enemy. Michael slammed the car door shut. The chilling, synthesized voice from the phone still echoed in his mind. "We know what you saw. We'll be in touch." He was no longer a man with problems, he was a hunted animal, and his children were the bait. His world had shifted from the predictable order of a Fortune 500 company to a dark, chaotic game of survival. He started the car and drove, not toward his gated community in the Los Angeles suburbs, but to a place no one would think to look, a seedy motel in a city he didn't own. He sat in the dimly lit room, the stale air thick with the smell of cheap cleaner, and waited for his new team. The first to arrive was Leo, the disgraced programmer. He was a man of contrasts, brilliant mind, tattered clothes, and the weary eyes of a ghost who had seen too many screens. "Michael," Leo said, his voice flat. "It's been a while. You owe me." Michael pushed a briefcase filled with cash across the table. "You'll be paid in full. What I need from you is to track a signal. I need you to find a ghost." He told Leo about the live stream and the encrypted chat. Leo's eyes, dull moments before, now lit up with the thrill of the chase. "You have a network of live streamers working for you, and a COO who's a co-conspirator. That's not just a ghost, Michael. That's a whole haunted house. And I'm going to burn it to the ground." If you want to see how he takes on a powerful enemy with only a laptop, subscribe now and don't miss out. Next, Elena arrived. Her face was as hard as granite, her eyes missing nothing. She didn't shake his hand, she just looked at the briefcase and then at Michael's face. "You look like a man who just lost everything," she said. Michael told her everything, from the hot water to the live stream, from the COO to the chilling phone call. Elena's face remained impassive. She was a professional, trained to handle the worst of humanity, but for the first time, Michael saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a faint sadness. "These are not just criminals," she said. "They are predators. They're making money off a sick audience." She nodded at Leo. "He'll give you the technical side. I'll get you the human side. They have a network. I will find a way in." Lastly, Liam arrived, looking out of place in his oversized hoodie and faded jeans. He was a stark contrast to Michael's world of tailored suits and polished shoes. Michael had given him a job at his company out of a sense of duty. He never imagined he would have to rely on him. "You called me?" Liam asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant. Michael sat him down and explained the situation. He expected to see fear, maybe even a look of, "I told you so." But all he saw was a quiet resolve in Liam's eyes. "They think they're playing a game," Liam said. "They think it's a game of chess. But they don't realize that they're playing with fire. They didn't count on you, or me, or us. We will win." He had a rare understanding of the systems, the loopholes, and the people on the other side of the fence. He was their secret weapon. Michael felt a surge of hope for the first time since he had seen his children in the kitchen. He had a team, a ragtag team of outcasts and misfits. But they were all he had. The team worked through the night. Leo, with his fingers flying across the keyboard, hacked into the servers, trying to find the origin of the live stream and the chat. Elena, with her contacts in the city's darkest underbelly, was asking questions, pulling on threads. And Liam, with his sharp, analytical mind, was piecing together the network, looking for patterns and connections that no one else could see. If you're enjoying this, don't forget to subscribe, because this is just the beginning. The sun rose over the Los Angeles skyline, and Michael watched it from his motel room window. He had a name for his network now. He called it Operation Unseen. He had to stay out of sight, off the grid, and out of reach of his enemy. Meanwhile, Olivia, the maid, was in a safe house. She had a new phone, a new bank account, and a new identity. She was a ghost, a professional, and she was already moving on to her next target. She was getting ready to do the same thing all over again. What you don't know, and she doesn't know, is that Elena has already located her next target, and a plan is being put in place to catch her in the act. But there's a whole lot more to this story than that. This is the moment when Michael realizes that his life will never be the same again. Only subscribers will know what happens next. Michael was now a fugitive. The media had already reported that he had disappeared, and the company was in chaos. He knew that this was just a ploy, a game of cat and mouse. He was determined to win. He would not stop until his children were safe and his enemies were brought to justice. His phone rang again. It was the same unknown number. He braced himself, ready for another threat. But the voice was different this time. It was the COO. "Michael," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "I know you're watching. I know you're planning something. You're no match for us." He hung up, leaving Michael with a powerful sense of dread. The game had begun, and he was the one being hunted. He looked at his team. They were his last hope, his last chance to get his children back. Leo's fingers flew across the keyboard, a chaotic dance of a digital symphony. He was a phantom in a world of zeros and ones, a master of what the world wanted to keep hidden. While Michael's life had crumbled, Leo's was just beginning to take shape. He burrowed deeper into the dark web, his goal clear: find the network behind the live stream. The air in the seedy motel room was thick with the scent of stale cigarettes and burning circuits. Michael, Elena, and Liam watched him, their own anxieties palpable. They knew that with every key he struck, he was pulling back the curtain on an evil more profound than they had dared to imagine. What he found was worse than they had imagined. It wasn't just a live stream. It was a twisted auction. The chat logs Michael had seen were not just comments, they were bids for a sick, perverse kind of entertainment. The highest bidder got to choose what happened next. Michael's children were not just a show, they were products, and a powerful network of sick individuals was willing to pay a fortune to see them suffer. The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. This wasn't a corporate conspiracy, it was a criminal enterprise of the highest order. It was the darkest side of humanity, and it was using technology to bring it into people's homes. Leo traced the transactions back to a series of shell corporations, all of them connected to a single, powerful holding company he had never heard of. The COO was just the tip of the iceberg. The entire network was a web of CEOs, politicians, and powerful figures in Hollywood and New York. They were the people Michael had sat next to at charity galas and played golf with. The people who controlled the world he had once so proudly inhabited were now his enemies. He discovered that Michael's children were not the first. There were other victims, other live streams, other auctions. Leo showed him a timeline of the events, and a map of where they had taken place. They were all over the country, and they all followed the same pattern. The thought made Michael sick. He had been so blind, so caught up in his own world, that he had failed to see the evil lurking in plain sight. Only subscribers get the full, unedited story. Meanwhile, Elena was doing her own digging. She was a professional in the art of information, a master of a different kind of shadow. She went to the places where the city's underbelly thrived, the dimly lit bars, the back alleys, the hidden corners of the internet where secrets were traded for a price. What she found was a chilling pattern. She discovered that a new maid was hired every few months for each live stream. It was a perfectly executed plan that left no trace. They had no idea they were a part of something so sinister. The organization that ran the auctions was careful, methodical, and ruthless. They never used the same person twice, and they never left a trail. She also found out that Olivia, the maid who had been with Michael's children, was not her real name. It was an alias, a ghost in the system. The woman had been groomed for this for a long time. She was a professional. She had been working for a secret organization that provided live streamers, and it was that organization that was responsible for the auctions. If you want to know what happens to the people who betray you, subscribe and find out. Liam, meanwhile, was connecting the dots. He was a master of patterns and behavior. He had a deep understanding of how these kinds of networks operated. He saw that the COO was not the leader, but a middleman. The true leader was an anonymous user in the live stream, someone who was not afraid of being exposed. They were a ghost, a puppeteer, pulling the strings from the shadows. He was the one that they were afraid of. He was the one who was controlling everyone. If you're not subscribed, you're missing out on the biggest twists. Michael realized that he was in a fight for his life, and his children were the prize. The enemies were not a distant, faceless corporation, but the people in his own backyard. The world he had built, the people he had trusted, were all part of a dark, twisted network. His money, his power, his influence, all of it was worthless now. He was a man who had everything, and now he had nothing. He had to be a ghost, too, a phantom in his own life, in order to win this game. He looked at his team, these outcasts, these misfits, and he realized that they were his greatest asset. They were the ones who saw the world for what it was, the ones who had nothing to lose. Only they could help him save his children. Don't be left behind in the dark. Subscribe and find out what happens next. If you're still not subscribing, comment what's holding you back. The chapter ends with a shocking discovery. Leo finds a hidden message inside the code of the live stream. It's a personal message to Michael, written in his own COO's handwriting. "You're a great father," it says. "But you're a terrible man. And we will get you." The message was a warning, a taunt, and a confirmation of Michael's worst fears. They knew he was watching. The game was no longer about money or power, it was a personal vendetta. The team looked at each other, their faces grim. They were in a war, and their enemy knew their every move. They had to act fast. They had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than their enemies. They had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan that could either save his children or get them all killed. The fate of his children, and his own life, now rested on the shoulders of these three misfits. The air in the motel room was thick with the silent weight of their plan. It was a strategy born of desperation, a gamble where the stakes were Michael's children and his very life. He looked at his team, a hacker who lived in the digital shadows, a street-smart operative with a past as murky as a back alley, and a former cop who saw patterns where others saw chaos. They were his only hope. His billions meant nothing in this war. It was a fight of ghosts against ghosts, and Michael had to become the most dangerous one of all. Their first move was to create a digital ghost of Michael himself. Leo, hunched over his rig, created a series of encrypted messages and financial transactions that made it appear as if Michael was fleeing the country. Fake tickets to London, an untraceable bank transfer to a Swiss account, and a series of social media posts from a burner phone. He wanted them to think he was running, that he was scared, that he was playing their game. They wouldn't see the real him, the man preparing for war. He was a phantom, a whisper in the wind, a shadow in the night. He was gone, and they would never find him. If you want to know what happens to the people who betray you, subscribe and find out. Elena's mission was far more dangerous. She had to go back into the world she had left behind, the world of whispers and shadows. She went to the city's underbelly, the places where secrets were traded for a price. She was looking for a specific kind of information, a list of the clients who used the auction service. The organization was careful, but even the most careful criminals made mistakes. Elena knew where to look, and she was not afraid of what she would find. She met with a contact in a dimly lit bar, a man with cold eyes and a colder heart. She gave him a flash drive with Michael's personal information on it. It was a risky move, but it was the only way to get his attention. He was the kind of person who would sell his own mother for a profit. And he was the kind of person who could get her the information she needed. What Elena discovered was a chilling web of names. The list was a who's who of the world Michael had once been a part of. CEOs of major corporations, politicians with spotless public images, and celebrities who were adored by millions. They were the people who controlled the world he had once so proudly inhabited, and they were all part of this twisted network. Elena felt sick to her stomach. The world was not what it seemed, and she was a pawn in a game she did not understand. She was a soldier in a war that was not her own, and the fate of Michael's children rested on her shoulders. Don't be left behind in the dark. Subscribe and find out what happens next. While Elena and Leo were working in the shadows, Liam was working in the light. He was the face of their operation, the man who was not afraid to speak the truth. He went to a series of news outlets, carefully leaking a few, carefully curated documents. He gave them enough information to get their attention, but not enough to expose their entire plan. He was a master of misdirection, a puppeteer pulling the strings of the media. The news outlets, hungry for a story, jumped at the chance. They started to investigate, and they started to ask questions. The conspiracy, which had been so carefully hidden, was now starting to unravel. The COO was the first to react. He tried to discredit Liam, to paint him as a disgruntled ex-employee. But the news outlets, sensing a bigger story, ignored him. They went after the shell corporations, and they started to ask questions about the holding company. The COO was a pawn, and now he was caught between two powerful forces, the media and his boss. The game was no longer about money or power, it was a personal vendetta, and Michael was winning. If you're still not subscribing, comment what's holding you back. Michael, watching from the safety of the motel room, felt a glimmer of hope. His plan was working. His enemies were starting to fight among themselves. He saw their fear, their desperation, their panic. They were scrambling, and he knew it was a sign of weakness. But he also knew that they were dangerous. They were cornered animals, and they would do anything to survive. He had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than his enemies. He looked at his children's faces, and he knew that he would not rest until they were safe. The chapter ends with a shocking discovery. Leo finds a hidden message inside the code of the live stream. It's a personal message to Michael, written in his own COO's handwriting. "You're a great father," it says. "But you're a terrible man. And we will get you." The message was a warning, a taunt, and a confirmation of Michael's worst fears. They knew he was watching. The game was no longer about money or power, it was a personal vendetta. The team looked at each other, their faces grim. They were in a war, and their enemy knew their every move. They had to act fast. They had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than their enemies. They had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan that could either save his children or get them all killed. The fate of his children, and his own life, now rested on the shoulders of these three misfits. The city, a sprawling monument to ambition, had never felt so alien to Michael. Every skyscraper, every glass facade, seemed to mock him, a silent testament to the wealth and power he had so easily lost. Now, operating from a nondescript van parked a few blocks from his former empire, he was a ghost in his own life. The irony was a bitter taste. He had built this city, and now it was a hunting ground, with him as the prey. If you want to know what happens to the people who betray you, subscribe and find out. Leo, hunched over a laptop, was a whirlwind of focused energy. His fingers danced across the keyboard, a symphony of commands and codes that would bring the digital world to its knees. He was the ghost in the machine, and he was working on two key things. The first was a digital paper trail, a series of breadcrumbs that would lead the authorities to the shell corporations and the holding company. The second was the live stream. He was a master of his craft, and he was able to manipulate the stream, subtly changing the camera angles and the audio to create a sense of unease and dread. He was a puppeteer, and his puppets were the very people who had wronged him. Meanwhile, Elena was on the ground, a phantom in her own right. She moved through the city's shadows, a whisper in the wind, gathering intelligence from her old contacts. She had a list of names, and she was checking each one, looking for any sign of a connection to the COO. She was a professional, a woman with a past as murky as the back alleys she now frequented. She was a soldier in a war that was not her own, and the fate of Michael's children rested on her shoulders. She was a woman on a mission, a woman with a secret, and she would not rest until she had her answers. Liam was the face of their operation, the man who was not afraid to speak the truth. He was the one who had been wronged, and he was not afraid to tell the world about it. He gave a series of interviews, carefully leaking more documents, more information, more secrets. He was a master of misdirection, a puppeteer pulling the strings of the media. The news outlets, hungry for a story, jumped at the chance. They started to investigate, and they started to ask questions. The conspiracy, which had been so carefully hidden, was now starting to unravel. The COO was the first to react. He tried to discredit Liam, to paint him as a disgruntled ex-employee. But the news outlets, sensing a bigger story, ignored him. They went after the shell corporations, and they started to ask questions about the holding company. The COO was a pawn, and now he was caught between two powerful forces, the media and his boss. The game was no longer about money or power, it was a personal vendetta, and Michael was winning. If you're still not subscribing, drop a comment what's holding you back. Michael, watching from the safety of the van, felt a glimmer of hope. His plan was working. His enemies were starting to fight among themselves. He saw their fear, their desperation, their panic. They were scrambling, and he knew it was a sign of weakness. But he also knew that they were dangerous. They were cornered animals, and they would do anything to survive. He had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than his enemies. He looked at his children's faces, and he knew that he would not rest until they were safe. A notification from Leo's laptop brought their focus back to the grim reality. He had managed to patch into a secure channel and found a real-time message exchange between the COO and a previously unknown individual. The conversation was a chilling monologue of cold, calculated cruelty. "The twins are getting more difficult," the message read. "They're crying too much. We will have to put them on a sedative." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked at Elena and Liam, his eyes burning with a fire that had not been there before. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and he would stop at nothing to get his children back. Don't be left behind in the dark. Subscribe and find out what happens next. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with a horrifying thud. Elena, following a lead on the names she had collected, discovered that the holding company wasn't a faceless entity. It was an organization, a brotherhood, an ancient society that operated in the shadows. The auction was not for corporate secrets, but for a far more valuable and sinister commodity: children. They were a cult, and they were using the live stream as a way to control their victims, to manipulate them, to turn them into pawns in their twisted game. The children were their source of power, their source of income, their source of control. They were not just victims, they were their very lifeblood. The team looked at each other, their faces grim. They were no longer in a war about money or power. They were in a war against a force far more evil than they could have imagined. They had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan that could either save his children or get them all killed. The fate of his children, and his own life, now rested on the shoulders of these three misfits. They had to act fast. They had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than their enemies. They were in a race against time, a race for their very souls. The information Elena uncovered was not just data, it was a physical weight, a vile truth that coated the sterile air of the motel room. The holding company was not a name on a corporate ledger, it was a ghost in the shadows, an ancient brotherhood that operated beyond the reach of law. They called themselves the architects, and their currency wasn't money, it was power, derived from the very souls of their victims. The auction was the chilling culmination of their work, a human market where children were sold to the highest bidder. This was not a betrayal of trust, it was a perversion of life itself. The knowledge ignited a cold fire in Michael's gut, a rage so pure it burned away every last trace of his former self. He was no longer a billionaire, he was a father on the verge of losing everything, and he was ready to become a monster to save his children. "They have a private server," Leo announced, his voice a low growl of disgust. "It's a hub for their communications, a place where they coordinate the transactions." He pulled up a complex, pulsating network map on his screen. It was a digital fortress, protected by layers of encryption, but Leo was a ghost in the machine, and he knew how to move in the shadows. He traced the lines of connection, and they all led to one single point, a remote estate in upstate New York, hidden deep in the woods. The architect's chamber. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. The location was familiar. It was an old hunting lodge he had visited once, a place owned by the head of the holding company. He remembered the man's name, Alistair Thorne. He was a quiet, unassuming man who had a reputation for being an eccentric recluse. But now, Michael saw the truth. Thorne was the high priest of this cult, the very architect of his children's suffering. The man who had been a trusted advisor, a mentor, and a friend. The very man who he had trusted to protect his children was the one who had kidnapped them. Elena, her face a mask of grim determination, began to research Thorne. She uncovered a dark history of missing persons, suspicious deaths, and a network of foundations and charities that were nothing more than fronts for his twisted enterprise. He was a ghost, a myth, a man who didn't exist in the real world. His power came from his anonymity, his ability to manipulate events from the shadows. The children were not just a commodity, they were a source of power, their suffering a ritual, a sacrifice. If you want to know what happens to the people who betray you, subscribe and find out. Liam, his heart filled with a righteous fury, took their new information to the media. The news outlets, a whirlwind of hungry journalists, were now in a feeding frenzy. The story of Michael's disappearance, which had been a human interest story, was now a conspiracy theory, a dark tale of corporate betrayal and a secret society. The media was a weapon, a powerful tool that could be used to expose the truth. But Thorne was not a man to be trifled with. He used his connections, his power, and his money to discredit Liam, to paint him as a disgruntled ex-employee who was making up stories for fame and money. The news outlets, sensing a bigger story, ignored him. They went after the shell corporations, and they started to ask questions about the holding company. The COO was a pawn, and now he was caught between two powerful forces, the media and his boss. The game was no longer about money or power, it was a personal vendetta, and Michael was winning. Michael, watching from the safety of the van, felt a glimmer of hope. His plan was working. His enemies were starting to fight among themselves. He saw their fear, their desperation, their panic. They were scrambling, and he knew it was a sign of weakness. But he also knew that they were dangerous. They were cornered animals, and they would do anything to survive. He had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than his enemies. He looked at his children's faces, and he knew that he would not rest until they were safe. If you're still not subscribing, drop a comment what's holding you back. The team now had a clear objective, they had to go to Thorne's estate and get the children back. It was a suicide mission, a desperate gamble that could either save his children or get them all killed. Michael, the man who had once commanded an army of lawyers and bodyguards, was now relying on a hacker, a former operative, and a disgruntled ex-employee. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and he would stop at nothing to get his children back. The fate of his children, and his own life, now rested on the shoulders of these three misfits. They had to act fast. They had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than their enemies. They were in a race against time, a race for their very souls. As the team prepares for the final showdown, Michael makes a final, chilling discovery. Liam, following a lead on the names he had collected, discovers that Thorne's organization wasn't a faceless entity. It was an organization, a brotherhood, an ancient society that operated in the shadows. The auction was not for corporate secrets, but for a far more valuable and sinister commodity, children. They were a cult, and they were using the live stream as a way to control their victims, to manipulate them, to turn them into pawns in their twisted game. The children were their source of power, their source of income, their source of control. They were not just victims, they were their very lifeblood. Don't be left behind in the dark. Subscribe and find out what happens next. The team looked at each other, their faces grim. They were no longer in a war about money or power. They were in a war against a force far more evil than they could have imagined. They had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan that could either save his children or get them all killed. The fate of his children, and his own life, now rested on the shoulders of these three misfits. They had to act fast. They had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than their enemies. They were in a race against time, a race for their very souls. The air in the motel room, once sterile and quiet, now crackled with a desperate, righteous fury. The map on the screen was no longer just a network of data, it was a physical roadmap to hell. Alistair Thorne's estate, the architect's chamber, glowed a malevolent red in the center of the screen, a digital scar on the pristine landscape of upstate New York. Michael, his hands clenched into fists, stared at the coordinates. He wasn't a CEO anymore, calculating risks and returns. He was a father, and the only metric that mattered was the survival of his children. His calm, collected facade had long since shattered, replaced by a primal rage that felt both terrifying and necessary. He was a man with a singular purpose, and nothing, not the vastness of Thorne's network nor the armed guards that surely surrounded the estate, would stand in his way. The main gate is a fortress, Elena said, her voice low and efficient as she analyzed a satellite image. Cameras, sensors, and a full security detail. The perimeter is electrified. This isn't a house, it's a vault. Good thing we aren't going through the front door, Leo muttered, his fingers dancing over his keyboard. He pulled up a complex set of blueprints, overlaid with red lines and digital access points. There's a service tunnel here, originally for the old hydroelectric power supply. It's been decommissioned and sealed, but not perfectly. A ghost of a bypass exists in their network. A blind spot. Liam, his face pale but determined, spoke up. "I'll be our distraction. I'll make a scene at the front gate. Something big enough to pull all the guards away from the tunnel. It'll buy you a few minutes, tops." Michael looked at the three of them, a disgraced IT guy, a former operative, and a journalist who had risked everything. They were a band of misfits, a far cry from the army of professionals he used to command, yet he trusted them more than anyone he had ever known. "A few minutes is all we need." He looked at Leo. "Can you get us inside and lock down their system once we're in?" "Their firewall is robust, but not invisible," Leo said, a grim smirk on his face. "I'll create a phantom signal, a digital storm that will make their main server think it's under a massive DDoS attack. It'll scramble their security and give us a window to get inside. Once we're in, I'll pull the pin on a digital grenade. Their entire network will go offline." "And their comms?" Elena asked, her hand on the handle of her tactical bag. "Dead," Leo confirmed. "No cameras, no alarms, no contact with the outside world. They'll be blind. And deaf. But it will only last as long as the digital storm. After that, they'll know we're there." The drive to the estate was a tense, silent affair. The landscape shifted from the endless gray of the highway to the deep, verdant green of the woods. The trees grew taller, denser, casting long, menacing shadows on the road. The air grew colder, a premonition of the evil that awaited them. Michael watched the GPS count down the miles, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He pictured his children's faces, their tear-streaked eyes and panicked expressions, and the image solidified his resolve. He would burn this place to the ground if he had to. He would become a monster to defeat a monster. If you want to know what happens to the people who betray you, subscribe and find out. They arrived at the coordinates just as dusk settled over the horizon. The estate was a sprawling, modern compound with high walls and an intricate security system. Liam, a beacon of courage, stepped out of the van and began his carefully planned act, yelling obscenities and demanding to speak to Alistair Thorne. The guards, annoyed and distracted, moved to confront him, just as he had hoped. Their focus was entirely on him, a single man with a loud mouth and a thirst for justice. That was their opening. Michael and Elena moved silently through the undergrowth, their movements fluid and practiced. They found the sealed tunnel entrance, a rusty metal door tucked behind a thicket of thorns. Leo, working from the van, sent a signal that disabled the lock. They were in. The tunnel was a dark, damp, and claustrophobic space. It smelled of decay and stale air. They moved in silence, their footsteps echoing in the darkness, the only sound the rhythmic beat of their hearts. They emerged into a vast basement, a chillingly pristine space filled with rows of server racks. This was the brain of Thorne's operation. "Their network is down," Leo's voice crackled through their earpieces. "You have a 10-minute window. After that, they'll reboot the system and the alarms will go off." 10 minutes it is," Michael whispered, his hand on Elena's shoulder. They moved quickly, their shadows dancing on the cold concrete walls. They found a service elevator and used it to ascend to the main floor. The doors opened to a surreal scene. This was not a hunting lodge, it was a museum of human cruelty. The walls were adorned with artifacts, relics of a long-forgotten age, and the air was thick with the scent of old wood and something far more sinister. They moved through the labyrinthine hallways, their senses on high alert. They found a set of ornate, wooden doors at the end of a long corridor. The doors were ajar, and a sliver of light emanated from within. This was it. The architect's chamber. Michael pushed the doors open, his heart in his throat. The room was vast, an old library converted into a command center. A massive screen on the far wall showed the live feed. It was his children. They were in a small, sterile room, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. They were not being tortured, not physically. They were being held captive, their innocence a commodity, their suffering a source of power for the twisted mind who controlled it. The room was empty save for a single desk, a single chair, and a single man who sat there, watching them. It was Alistair Thorne. He was a ghost, a myth, a man who didn't exist in the real world. His power came from his anonymity, his ability to manipulate events from the shadows. The children were not just a commodity, they were a source of power, their suffering a ritual, a sacrifice. If you want to know what happens to the people who betray you, subscribe and find out. I was beginning to think you wouldn't show up, Michael, Thorne said, his voice a low, melodious purr. He didn't look up from the screen, his gaze fixed on the children. Your little friends at the gate are making quite a ruckus. Michael felt a surge of adrenaline, a rush of pure, unadulterated fury. He walked toward Thorne, his strides long and purposeful. Where are they? Thorne chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. You think I would put them in the same room as the server? They're not here, Michael. They're a few miles away. In a place where you will never find them. But don't worry, you can still watch them from here. They are part of the ritual, you see. Michael's blood ran cold. The man was a monster. He had to be stopped. It's over, Thorne. Your game is done. We know everything. The world will know what you are. Thorne finally looked up, his eyes a cold, soulless gray. You think so? The world is not ready for the truth, Michael. They want a hero, a villain, a simple story. They don't want to know that the monsters are a part of them. They are in plain sight, controlling everything. You think your little band of misfits can bring me down? I am the architect. I have been building this network for a long time. You are just a small, insignificant cog in a very large machine. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The live feed went black. Leo. Michael hissed into his earpiece. The line was dead. Thorne laughed, a high-pitched, manic sound. Your friend is a fool. He thought he could outsmart me. I knew he would try to shut down my system. But I'm always one step ahead. I have a backup generator. And now, you are alone. A team of Thorne's men emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden by black masks. They were armed, silent, and deadly. Michael's heart sank. He was trapped. He was a father with nothing to lose, but he was facing an army of professionals. He looked at the live stream, and he saw a single tear roll down his daughter's face, and he knew that he had to fight. He had to be the hero his children deserved. He had to become a monster to defeat a monster. Michael, a man who had spent his life in boardrooms and penthouses, now fought for his life in a silent, brutal ballet of violence. He used his wits, his rage, and his determination. He was not a trained fighter, but he had something his enemies didn't have, a reason to live. He fought with the fury of a cornered animal, and he was winning. He fought with the love of a father, and he was unstoppable. He fought with the rage of a man who had lost everything, and he was a force of nature. He was a ghost, a myth, a man who didn't exist in the real world. His power came from his love for his children, and he was unstoppable. If you're still not subscribing, drop a comment what's holding you back. As the last of Thorne's men fell, Michael turned to face his enemy. Thorne was gone. He had vanished, a ghost in the shadows. Michael felt a sense of dread. He knew that Thorne would not be defeated so easily. He would be back. He would be smarter, faster, and more ruthless. Michael had to find his children. He had to act fast. He had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than his enemies. He was in a race against time, a race for their very souls. He ran from the chamber, Elena hot on his heels. The alarms were blaring now, a deafening shriek that echoed through the dark hallways. He felt a surge of panic, a cold hand of fear wrapping around his throat. He had defeated Thorne's men, but he had failed to find his children. He had to think, to be a CEO again, to come up with a plan that would save his children. He had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than his enemies. He was in a race against time, a race for his very souls. He looked at Elena, and he saw a look of terror on her face. He knew that he had to be strong for her, for his children, for his friends. He had to be a hero, a father, a man with nothing left to lose. He had to be a monster to defeat a monster. He and Elena escaped through the service tunnel, their hearts pounding in their chests. They ran through the darkness, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They were on the run, on the lam, on the run for their lives. They had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than their enemies. They were in a race against time, a race for their very souls. They reached the van, and they saw Liam and Leo waiting for them, their faces a mask of grim determination. They were a band of misfits, a far cry from the army of professionals he used to command, yet he trusted them more than anyone he had ever known. They were his friends, his family, his everything. They were his only hope. "The police are here," Liam said, his voice a low growl. "Thorne called them in. He's painting us as terrorists." Michael felt a surge of rage. Thorne was a master manipulator, a monster who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. He had to be stopped. Michael knew that he was now in a race against time. He had to find his children before Thorne could get to them. He had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than his enemies. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and he would stop at nothing to get his children back. The fate of his children, and his own life, now rested on the shoulders of these three misfits. They had to act fast. They had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than their enemies. They were in a race against time, a race for their very souls. Don't be left behind in the dark. Subscribe and find out what happens next. The final act was a race against the clock. Michael, using his extensive knowledge of the city's underbelly, navigated a complex web of backstreets and hidden alleys. Liam, in the van, worked with Leo to create a digital ghost, a false signal that would lead the police on a wild goose chase. Elena, her past as an operative resurfacing, provided intel on Thorne's private security and their movements. They were a symphony of desperation and skill, a final, beautiful dance of survival. They found the safe house, a small, unassuming cabin tucked away in a remote forest. The place was silent, eerie, and still. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the door. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. A shiver of dread ran down his spine. He pushed the door open, his hand on Elena's shoulder. The cabin was empty. No children. No Thorne. Just a single, chilling note on the table. "Better luck next time, Michael," the note read. "The game has just begun." Michael crumpled the note in his fist, his rage a fiery tempest in his soul. He had failed. He had lost everything. He had lost his children. The story had come to a full circle, but with a twist. The hero had been defeated, the villain had won, and the children were still in danger. It was not a happy ending, but it was a realistic one. The fight was not over. It had just begun. The story had come to a full circle, but with a twist. The hero had been defeated, the villain had won, and the children were still in danger. It was not a happy ending, but it was a realistic one. The fight was not over. It had just begun.